My name is Kieran Lyon. I'm a psychology teacher at the University of Nottingham. I'm going through overviewing important psychology books. This week, we're going through a classic, Mind in Society by Lev Vygotsky. There he is. And the whole idea of the book, it's about how people learn to think through interacting with others. Now, Lev Vygotsky was a developmental psychologist, and what that means is he's studying the development, the formation, the emergence of thinking abilities such as memory and attention and language. He was working in the 20s and 30s, 1920s and 30s in the Soviet Union. And he started as a teacher, but then later on went to study, in fact, founded an research institute to study how to help to teach children with learning disabilities. And so what he's trying to do is to figure out, how do we help children to learn? Now, in order to understand Vygotsky, there's two things you need to know in advance. And the first one is you need to know about the political context in which he's writing. So, Soviet Union, 1920s and 30s. And this was a communist totalitarian state. And what that meant was that if you wanted to be a researcher, you wanted to publish your articles and you wanted to publish your books, and you wanted to continue working and you didn't want to go to jail, then you had to believe in and show support for the state ideology, the state's political belief system, which was Marxism. Now, Vygotsky believed in Marxism, and it's necessary for me to cover this, for me to discuss this, in order to explain Vygotsky. So this is an oversimplification, but Marxism, to some degree, was a theory of history. So Marxists believed that history, human history, was best understood as a series of stages of development over time, and that each of these stages was marked by conflict over tools, and that one stage went to another stage through a violent revolution, a violent political revolution. So the example would be the conflict between workers in a factory and the tools, the machinery that could replace them. So the Marxist idea was that the workers would take over in a revolution. They take over the tools, and this would create a perfect utopian state. Now, what Vygotsky was doing is he was taking this Marxist idea about history in terms of tools and in terms of revolution, and applying that to the life of each person. So what he was trying to do is he was trying to understand how tools, thinking tools, the tools of language, science in particular, the use of science to think, changed how people think. The basic idea was that the development of language leads to a revolution in the way that you think. So the argument he's making is that the kind of psychological organism you are before you develop language is completely different to how you think after you develop language. Now, you could look upon this with a little bit of suspicion, and you could say, well, he starts with the political belief and works backwards. But the good thing about Vygotsky is, as well as being a believer, he's a scientist. And that means that if you take the politics away from it entirely, it still makes a lot of sense. It's still solid research. And it's also important to mention that because it helps to contextualize the terms that he's using, because he's talking about historical development, he's talking about labor, he's talking about tools. And in this series of essays, which, by the way, was published after his death, it was published in 1979, he's making the argument that the revolution, the main change in your ability to think, is through language. So you have the way you think before language and the way you think after, or when you develop language. Now, before language, he says that you're kind of ape-like, that your ability to think is limited to the sensory information around you, what you can see, what you can hear, etc. And that's all stimulus, information coming in, which then determines the response. So you have input and output. That's the behaviorist idea, stimulus response. And so loud noise, the child cries, or some food the child doesn't like, disgusted face, disgust response, all stimulus response. But then what happens when you develop language in Vygotsky's scheme is that first you have stimulus, and then once you develop the ability to understand the world with signs, and that includes language, then you can organize those signs in your mind in order to organize your response. And that leads to the development of higher thinking processes such as better perception and memory and planning, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. Now, in order to explain Vygotsky in some detail, I need to talk about how his work builds on the work of a previous developmental psychologist by the name of Jean Piaget. Now, Piaget had come up with a theory of development. It was called the cognitive theory of development, which said that children learn in a set of stages across their maturation over childhood, and they start by thinking concretely with physical examples, and then abstractly, and by abstract I mean without the use of needing physical examples. So you have to understand how to share a pizza before you can understand how to divide numbers. That would be an example of going from concrete to abstract. Now, Piaget believed that the development of thinking abilities, the children's improvement in their ability to think, these higher thinking processes, he thought they improved naturally, that you just naturally develop these through growing up, through maturation. Vygotsky said no. Vygotsky said that children only develop these higher thinking processes, language, better perception, memory, etc., because of social interaction. So we have this idea that you should think before you speak. You probably heard that phrase, think before you speak. We have this idea that you organize your thoughts in your head and then you say it out loud. Now, Vygotsky said, actually, when you're learning to think, when you're learning cognitive abilities in childhood, it's actually the other way around. What actually happens is that you learn to speak, and then that turns into thinking. So here's a great quotation from the book. The book's very short, only about 150, 200 pages. He said, "The history of the process of internalization of speech is also the history of the socialization of the child's practical intellect." What does that mean? And what that means is that the ability to think in your head, the ability to organize your thoughts with signs, comes from social interaction. So you talk with others, so you talk with your parents, and you talk with your teachers, and you talk with the other children. And in order to communicate, you need to develop signs. So we have all these different sets of phenomenon, and in order to communicate, I have to come up with a sign. So we have all these things, and I can put a sign to this thing for table, a sign for this thing for toy, a sign for this kind of movement. We have this activity that we can call game. And so once we have those signs, then what you can do, once we have those signs which come through the interaction, is then you can use those signs to organize your thoughts. The kind of studies that Vygotsky was doing is that he'd watch how children would solve problems over time and also at different ages to see how their problem solving ability improved. So that could be a problem such as, when you see a particular picture, press a particular key on a keyboard. And what he found is that, first of all, children were able to communicate, talk to the experimenter, and then once they were able to do that, then they would talk out loud, which he called egocentric speech. I will do this, and then I will do this, and then I will do this. And then after that, they thought in their head. And if you got a child at that stage where they were saying everything out loud, Vygotsky would say, okay, try to do the task, try to solve the problem without speaking. They couldn't, they just freeze. So what was happening is that you'd learn to speak, and then you'd learn to think. Thinking is basically silent speech. And there's some good research coming out of the University of British Columbia showing that when you think in your head, what's actually happening is that your voice box is moving a little bit as if you were speaking subaudibly. And if you're deaf and you use sign language, then what tends to happen is that people who use sign language tend to think by imagining moving their arms, imagining gesticulating using sign language. So thinking comes from communication rather than the other way around. Okay, so now we have that the thinking comes from communication. Vygotsky called this his socio-cultural theory of development. And now what we can do is now we can think with signs, and now that allows us to perceive the world better, because now the child begins to perceive the world not only with his eyes but with his speech. Now we've labeled these things. This thing is game, and within that is fair game, and we have this word for this and this word for that, this word for play, this word for table, these different words, and now we can organize our thoughts, and now we can actually have words for things that don't physically exist, such as division, the mathematical function. And now we can outsource our thinking. We can keep our thoughts in the outside places. We can write things down. We can write notes. We can have tally charts and such. We can outsource our ability to remember things. So we can remember with the help of science. And now that we can use science to think, we're not just limited in our thinking of what's happening now. We can organize our thoughts about the past and the future, and that allows us to plan. One important way that people learn to think through interaction is with play. So we have the older, more almost Victorian idea that children should just work like adults and shouldn't play. No, Vygotsky says that children learn to think by playing. You have a girl with a doll or a piece of wood. Remember, this was 100 years ago. A piece of wood that she's pretending is a doll. You think, well, this is a girl who's doing this with a piece of wood. It's like, no, it's really smart, because what she's done is she's taken the idea of doll and put it into the piece of wood. So let's imagine children who are playing. What you do is you take the idea of, let's say you have a horse, and then you turn that into the action of acting out as a horse, and then that allows you to, it's another step to understand the idea of the horse. And so what you're doing is when you're playing, you're transferring one idea to represent another idea. That allows for the development of abstract thinking. And so children learn to think using play. It's very impressive. Now, how would you apply that in the real world? Because the thing about Vygotsky, he was a very practical man. Remember, he was trying to figure out how children learn, how to help children to learn. So this wasn't just abstract theory, this was trying to solve a real problem. And so he found that children learn through interaction and with play. And so here's an example of how we could use that. So if you want to teach children how to add and subtract these different mathematical functions, then what you could do is you could just write these sums on the board. But the problem with that is that getting the child to do the sums on the board doesn't mean that the children actually understand what's going on. What you can do instead is you could kind of set it up as a game. Some of you are going to be the shopkeeper. Some of you are going to be the customers. We can make a game out of it. You're playing. And then from that, part of the game is we'll work out the change. And part of the game is that we'll have to work out how to share the bill and so on. And so what we've done is we've made it more concrete. So we're building from the previous developmental stage. So the idea is that you don't just teach the child at their current level of ability, you stretch them through interaction to get to the next stage of thinking. And you also want to do it through interaction and play, because then by talking and interacting with each other, the children are organizing their own thoughts. Now, unfortunately, Vygotsky had a rather short life. He died in the 1930s of tuberculosis, but nevertheless, these ideas had an extraordinary influence on the field of cognitive psychology and also the field of education. And so if you're interested in either of those fields, this is an amazing book to start with. It's actually only about, like I said, 100 to 200 pages long. I'd very much recommend.